In the basement archives of the Taney County Courthouse, a marriage certificate dated November 1891 documents the union of Margaret Ellen Pritchard, age 14, and Silas Pritchard, age 41. The county clerk's careful script identifies the groom's relationship to the bride, maternal uncle. Before we dive into the story, quick question. What's the creepiest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The Forsyth Weekly Herald reported the wedding in a single paragraph buried on page 4, describing it as a quiet family ceremony held at the Pritchard homestead in the hills north of town. No mention appeared of the bride's age or the familial connection between the parties. Local custom in the Ozark Hill Country during the late 19th century often treated such matters as private family business, beyond the scrutiny of outsiders or official concern. Margaret had been born in 1877 to Edmund Pritchard and his wife Sarah, who was Silas's younger sister. The family worked a modest farm in the White River Valley, struggling with the rocky soil and isolation that characterized much of the region. When Sarah died of fever in 1888, Edmund found himself alone with 4 daughters and mounting debts. His brother-in-law Silas owned valuable timberland in the mountains, land Edmund had borrowed against and could not repay. The arrangement between the two men was conducted without documentation beyond the marriage certificate itself. Edmund's financial obligations to Silas were substantial, accumulated over years of failed harvests and poor decisions. In the autumn of 1891, Edmund brought his eldest daughter to Silas's remote property, 15 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest and across treacherous creek crossings. No record exists of Margaret's consent or objection. Missouri law in 1891 set no minimum age for marriage with parental permission, and marriages between uncles and nieces, while uncommon, were not explicitly prohibited. The ceremony was performed by a traveling preacher whose name appears nowhere in county records, suggesting he may have been compensated for his discretion rather than his devotion to proper documentation. Silas Pritchard had been married once before. His first wife, Anna, died in 1889 under circumstances. The local physician declined to specify beyond complications of a domestic nature in his report. She left no children. The timber claim Silas worked sat in a hollow surrounded by steep ridges, a location chosen for its abundant oak and hickory rather than its accessibility. Winter snows regularly blocked the trail for months at a time, and even in favorable weather, the journey to Forsyth required most of a day. Margaret's sisters later recalled that she wept the morning she left with their father, but Edmund told them she was simply nervous about her new responsibilities as a wife. The youngest sister, only 7 years old, remembered Margaret embracing her and whispering something she could not quite hear. That was the last time the family saw Margaret for 6 years. The timber claim consisted of a single-room cabin with a loft, a smokehouse, and a dilapidated barn that housed 2 mules and Silas's logging equipment. Margaret's duties began immediately. She cooked, cleaned, mended Silas's work clothes, and assisted with the brutal labor of felling trees and hauling timber down the mountain. A journal entry from a timber buyer who visited the property in 1893 describes seeing a young woman, visibly pregnant, loading cut logs onto a sledge while Silas negotiated prices inside the cabin. The isolation was absolute. The nearest neighbor, a hermit trapper named Virgil Cassidy, lived 4 miles away and rarely ventured past the Pritchard property line. Mail delivery did not extend into the hollow. Supplies arrived only when Silas made his quarterly trips to town, journeys Margaret was never permitted to join. He explained to the few people who asked that his wife preferred the quiet of the homestead and grew anxious in crowds. Margaret bore her first child in April 1892, a daughter she named Ruth after her mother's sister. No midwife attended the birth. Silas later told the storekeeper in Forsyth that his wife had delivered the baby without difficulty, though he purchased an unusual quantity of bandages and medicinal alcohol during that visit. Between 1892 and 1909, Margaret would bear 9 children total, 6 daughters and 3 sons. Court records discovered in 1923 reveal that Anna, Silas's first wife, had also borne children during their brief marriage. 2 infants, both boys, died within days of birth, according to burial records at the Baptist Cemetery outside Forsyth. Anna herself died 3 months after the second stillbirth. The attending physician, Dr. Harlan Kepler, noted in his private records that Anna had shown signs of sustained physical trauma inconsistent with childbirth complications, but he declined to investigate further, citing the difficulty of gathering evidence in such remote circumstances. Margaret adapted to the patterns Silas demanded. She rose before dawn to prepare his breakfast and pack his lunch for days spent in the timber. She taught herself to preserve meat, render lard, and stretch their limited supplies through the long winters when the trail became impassable. The children grew up speaking little, observing their mother's careful movements around their father, learning to read his moods and disappear when his temper darkened. Virgil Cassidy encountered Margaret only twice during those early years. The first time, in winter of 1894, he found her collecting firewood near the property boundary. She startled at his greeting and hurried back toward the cabin without responding. The second encounter, in summer of 1896, left him troubled enough to mention it in a letter to his sister in Springfield. He had heard screaming coming from the hollow one evening, sounds that carried through the forest for nearly an hour before falling silent. When he saw Margaret at the creek the following week, her left arm hung at an awkward angle, and dark bruises covered the visible portions of her neck and face. He asked if she needed help. Margaret shook her head and whispered that she had fallen while climbing down from the loft. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground. Cassidy returned to his camp and never spoke of the incident again, though his sister preserved his letter among her personal papers. On August 12, 1897, Margaret appeared at Thornton's General Store in Forsyth, 20 miles from the Pritchard homestead. The storekeeper, Zayapaya Thornton, documented the encounter in his personal diary, preserved now in the Stone County Historical Society archives. Margaret entered alone, carrying her youngest child, a girl barely a year old. Purple bruises ringed her throat like a necklace. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. She approached the counter and asked in a hoarse whisper if Thornton could arrange passage to Springfield, where her sister lived. She had no money, but offered to work off the debt. Thornton's wife, Constance, took Margaret into the back room, while Isaiah sent word to a freight wagon driver who made regular runs to Springfield. The driver agreed to transport Margaret the following morning. Constance later told her sister that Margaret wept while drinking the tea she was offered, not from pain, but from relief. She spoke rapidly about needing to reach safety before Silas discovered her absence, explaining that she had waited until he left for a 3-day timber delivery to a mill in Branson. The children remained at the homestead, Margaret said, because she could not manage all of them on foot, and planned to return for them once she secured her sister's help. The Thorntons provided Margaret with a room above the store. She barely slept, starting at every sound. Constance noted that Margaret kept her daughter pressed close to her body throughout the night, as though afraid someone might steal the child away. At dawn, Isaiah helped Margaret into the freight wagon. The driver departed just after sunrise. Silas Pritchard arrived at the store shortly before noon, 3 days ahead of schedule. He told Isaiah that his wife had become confused and hysterical, wandering away from the homestead in a state of mental disturbance brought on by the strain of childbearing. He expressed concern for her safety and asked if anyone had seen her. Isaiah, whose diary reveals his suspicion, but also his fear of Silas's reputation for violence, admitted that Margaret had been there, but claimed ignorance of her destination. Silas studied the storekeeper for a long moment before purchasing supplies and departing. He returned 2 days later, having somehow determined that Margaret had gone to Springfield. He said nothing to the Thorntons, but his expression, Isaiah wrote, was that of a man who had recovered lost property. Margaret's sister, Elizabeth Garrett, later testified in court documents from 1922 that Margaret arrived at her Springfield home on August 13th and stayed only 3 days. Elizabeth's husband, a railway clerk, had been sympathetic but frightened when Silas appeared at their door on August 16th. Silas presented his marriage certificate and explained calmly that his wife required his care and supervision. He mentioned that their 8 children needed their mother. Margaret begged Elizabeth not to let him take her. She clung to the door frame until Silas pried her fingers loose. Elizabeth's husband prevented her from intervening, citing the law's recognition of a husband's authority over his wife. They watched from their porch as Silas loaded Margaret into his wagon. She looked back once, her face empty of expression, before Silas drove away. No investigation followed. The Springfield police, when Elizabeth inquired, explained that domestic disputes between married couples fell outside their jurisdiction unless a death occurred. The children learned their mother's rules through observation rather than instruction. Speak only when spoken to. Never mention visitors or trips to town. Accept that father's word was law, enforced with his belt, or worse. Ruth, the eldest, remembered years later how her younger siblings would freeze at the sound of Silas's boots on the porch, their small bodies going rigid with learned caution. Silas educated the children himself, teaching them only what served his purposes, basic arithmetic for measuring timber, enough reading to understand contracts, nothing that might encourage questions about the world beyond the hollow. He forbade Margaret from teaching them anything he had not approved. When he discovered her attempting to show Ruth how to write her name in 1898, he burned the paper and confined Margaret to the cabin for 2 weeks. Letters discovered in 1962 by Margaret's youngest daughter, Clara, reveal a different education happening in secret. Margaret had hidden her mother's Bible in a crawl space beneath the cabin floor, retrieving it only when Silas worked deep in the timber, far enough away that his return would be heard in time. She taught the older children to read using its pages, her finger tracing words while they huddled together in whispers. The children believed their family was normal. They had no comparison, no visitors, except the occasional timber buyer who never entered the cabin or spoke to Margaret. Ruth later told a social worker that she was 12 years old before she understood that other children attended schools, played with friends, lived in houses where their mothers smiled and spoke freely. The isolation was so complete that the children developed their own private language, a mixture of words and gestures they used to communicate warnings about their father's moods. In spring of 1904, Silas found the Bible. Ruth, then 12, was showing her brother Thomas how to sound out words from the Book of Psalms when their father returned unexpectedly from checking his trap lines. He seized the Bible and threw it into the fireplace. The children scattered, but Margaret stepped forward, trying to retrieve it from the flames. Silas struck her across the face hard enough to knock her down. He continued beating her while the children watched, frozen in terror, until she stopped trying to rise. A timber buyer named Frank Ludlow arrived at the property 3 days later to discuss a large order. His written account, filed with his company's records in Kansas City, describes Silas conducting business as usual while his wife remained in the loft, unable to walk. Ludlow noted that he could hear her labored breathing from below, but Silas made no mention of her condition. The buyer returned 2 weeks later with payment. Margaret was moving again, though she limped badly and kept her head bowed throughout the transaction. Ludlow asked if she was well. Silas answered that his wife had taken a fall, but was recovering. Margaret said nothing, her hands trembling as she poured coffee for the men. After that day, the secret lessons stopped. The children never asked their mother to resume them, understanding without words that the cost had been too high. They grew into adolescence, accepting that their world consisted of the hollow, the timber, and their father's unpredictable violence. Ruth later said they stopped thinking of escape because they could not imagine anywhere to go. When America entered the Great War in 1917, Thomas was 22, his brother James 20, and the youngest son Samuel 18. The draft notice arrived by mail carrier, the first official correspondence the Pritchard homestead had ever received. Silas read it aloud at supper, his face darkening. He needed his sons for the timber work, but defying the federal government carried consequences even he could not avoid. The 3 young men left for training camp in September 1917. Margaret watched them depart from the cabin doorway, her face unreadable. Ruth later revealed that her mother had pulled each son aside the night before, whispering urgently, though Ruth could not hear the words. Thomas would only say that their mother had begged them to remember there was a world beyond the hollow, and to come back changed. The letters Thomas sent home were preserved by Clara, who found them in a wooden box beneath her mother's bed about Margaret's death in 1954. The early letters described training, the strangeness of so many men gathered together, the food that came at regular intervals. Thomas wrote carefully, aware his father would read every word. But as months passed and the brothers experienced life in the army, then France, the letters began to shift. Thomas described seeing families in French villages where fathers embraced their children, where women laughed freely with their husbands. He wrote about a medical officer who treated soldiers with gentleness, explaining injuries rather than simply barking orders. James, in his own letters, mentioned meeting men whose fathers had taught them trades without violence, whose mothers had attended school as girls. Samuel, the youngest, asked questions in his letters that Margaret never answered because Silas burned them before she could respond. The brothers returned in April 1919, changed in ways that extended beyond their uniforms and military bearing. They had seen how other people lived. They had witnessed kindness, structure, normalcy. The hollow felt smaller upon their return, the cabin more oppressive, their father's authority less absolute. Margaret was 42 but looked 60. Several teeth were missing, gaps visible when she opened her mouth to speak. She moved with a pronounced limp, favoring her left leg. Her hands shook constantly, and a scar ran from her temple to her jawline, poorly healed and silvered with age. The sons had left behind a woman already worn by hardship. They returned to find someone who appeared to have aged decades in their 2-year absence. Thomas asked his mother privately what had happened. She shook her head and changed the subject, but Ruth pulled him aside later and told him about the winter of 1918. Silas had accused Margaret of hiding money from the timber sales. She denied it because there was no money to hide. He had broken her leg with a piece of firewood, then left her to crawl to the water barrel while he worked his trap lines. Ruth, 16 at the time, had set the bone as best she could, using techniques she half remembered from watching a doctor treat a neighbor's horse years earlier. The brothers stood in the yard that evening, looking at the cabin, the timber, their father splitting wood with mechanical precision. They had survived trenches and artillery and poison gas. They had returned home to find a war still being fought, one that had raged for 28 years in a hollow no army would ever liberate. Dr. Vincent Kelly arrived at the Pritchard homestead in October 1919 as part of a rural health survey conducted by the State Medical Board. His notes, archived at the Missouri State Historical Society, describe finding Margaret outside the cabin, hanging laundry despite weather cold enough to freeze the wet fabric stiff. She wore no coat. Her dress hung loose on a frame he estimated at barely 90 pounds. Kelly introduced himself and explained his purpose. Margaret nodded but did not speak. He asked about her health, noting visible signs of malnutrition and what appeared to be improperly healed fractures in both hands. She answered in monosyllables until Silas emerged from the timber line. Then she fell completely silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. Kelly's report notes, patient exhibits behaviors consistent with sustained psychological trauma. Physical examination declined by husband on wife's behalf. Recommend follow-up impossible given geographic isolation and apparent domestic resistance. The census taker who visited in January 1920 recorded similar observations. Harold Finch's official census form lists the Pritchard household members with clinical precision, but his personal journal entry describes Margaret as a woman who flinches at shadows and speaks in whispers when she speaks at all. He noted that she served him coffee with hands that trembled so violently she nearly dropped the cup, and that Silas answered every question Finch directed at her, including those about her age and birthplace. Finch attempted to speak with Margaret alone when Silas went to retrieve documentation from the barn. She shook her head frantically and retreated into the cabin before he could ask anything of substance. Ruth intercepted him at the door, politely but firmly suggesting he finish his business quickly. Finch left disturbed enough to mention the visit to his supervisor, who noted that domestic situations fell outside the Census Bureau's authority. Reverend Paul Stanton visited the Hollow in June 1920 as part of his circuit through isolated Ozark communities. His journal, donated to the Baptist Historical Library in Springfield after his death, contains a lengthy entry about the Pritchard family. Stanton had been invited by Thomas, who attended a service in Forsyth and requested the minister visit his mother. The Reverend arrived on a Sunday afternoon, expecting to offer communion and spiritual counsel. What he found left him profoundly shaken. Margaret sat apart from the family during his visit, her posture suggesting someone trying to occupy as little space as possible. When Stanton asked if she would like to pray with him, Silas interrupted to say his wife was feeling poorly and preferred to rest. Margaret's expression never changed, but Stanton noticed tears tracking silently down her face. Before departing, Stanton managed a brief moment alone with Ruth when she walked him to his horse. He asked directly if her mother was in danger. Ruth's response, recorded in his journal, was careful. "My mother has endured more than any person should have to bear. We do what we can, but my father's authority is absolute here. The law recognizes his rights as husband. Our isolation protects him more than it protects us." Stanton wrote to the county sheriff describing his concerns. The reply, if any came, was never preserved. Missouri law in 1920 provided no mechanism for intervention in a legally recognized marriage, regardless of a wife's treatment, particularly when that wife made no formal complaint, and her husband was considered the sole authority over household matters. Ruth turned 29 in March 1921. A young man named David Brennan, who worked at the sawmill in Forsyth, had begun courting her during her increasingly frequent trips to town with Thomas to sell timber. David knew nothing of Ruth's family beyond what she chose to reveal, which was little. When he asked permission to marry her, Ruth told him he would need to speak with her father. David arrived at the homestead on a Saturday afternoon, nervous but respectful. Silas received him on the porch, listening to his formal request in silence. Then Silas said no. No explanation, no discussion. Ruth would remain at home where she belonged. David, bewildered, attempted to argue his case. He had steady employment, could provide well, loved Ruth sincerely. Silas told him to leave and never return. Ruth confronted her father that evening. Margaret was preparing supper when she heard her daughter's raised voice, something that never happened in Silas's house. Ruth demanded to know why she could not marry, why she had to remain trapped in the hollow when her brothers had seen the world beyond. Silas rose from his chair, his face darkening with rage. He told Ruth she would obey him or suffer consequences. Margaret stepped between them. It was instinctive, protective, the first time in decades she had directly opposed her husband. She told Silas that Ruth deserved her own life. The words were barely audible, but they hung in the cabin like a declaration of war. Silas struck Margaret with the back of his hand, a blow that sent her stumbling sideways. She fell against the stone fireplace hearth, her head connecting with the corner edge with a sound Thomas later described as sickeningly hollow. She collapsed to the floor and did not move. The children rushed to her. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark against the worn boards. Ruth screamed for someone to fetch Dr. Kelly, but Silas blocked the door. He said no doctor would be summoned, that Margaret had been clumsy and would recover as she always did. Thomas moved toward his father, fists clenched, but James grabbed his arm. They were strong young men now, hardened by war, but Silas still held absolute authority through decades of cultivated fear. Margaret regained consciousness after several minutes, though she seemed disoriented and confused. Blood continued to seep from the wound at her temple. Ruth cleaned and bandaged it while Silas watched from his chair, smoking his pipe as though nothing unusual had occurred. Margaret's left ear would never hear properly again. The damage permanent. That night, Ruth lay awake in the loft, listening to her mother's labored breathing from below. 30 years. Margaret had endured 30 years of this existence, and Ruth finally understood with complete clarity that her mother would die here unless someone acted. The visit from David Brennan had exposed a truth Ruth had been avoiding. Escape was possible, but only if they stopped waiting for permission and simply took it. She climbed down from the loft and found Thomas sitting outside, staring into the darkness. She sat beside him and spoke quietly. They had been to war. They had seen men fight for freedom. Their mother deserved nothing less. Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination. They would need a plan, careful timing, and absolute secrecy, but they would get their mother out. Thomas spent 4 months establishing a pattern. He began making regular timber deliveries to a mill 40 miles south, trips that required him to leave before dawn and return after dark. Silas, pleased with the additional income, encouraged these journeys. What Silas did not know was that Thomas used these trips to make arrangements with the Presbyterian mission in Springfield, an organization that quietly assisted women fleeing desperate circumstances. Ruth, meanwhile, cultivated her relationship with David Brennan, despite her father's prohibition. They met in town during supply runs, always briefly, always carefully. David secured a small house near the sawmill and agreed to provide temporary refuge if needed. He asked few questions, understanding only that Ruth's family situation was complicated and dangerous. The plan required Silas to be away from the homestead for at least 4 hours. Such opportunities were rare. He rarely traveled farther than Forsyth, and never left Margaret unsupervised for long. But in July 1921, a timber company from Kansas City contacted Silas about purchasing a substantial tract of old-growth oak on the North Ridge. The negotiation required Silas to meet their representative at a property line 12 miles distant, then walk the boundary to assess the trees. Thomas volunteered to accompany his father, but Silas refused. He wanted Thomas to continue work on a separate harvest. The meeting was scheduled for July 19th, early morning. Silas would need to leave before dawn and would not return until afternoon at the earliest. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Margaret knew nothing of the plan until the morning itself. Ruth feared her mother might inadvertently reveal something through her behavior, a glance or gesture that Silas would interpret correctly. Only after Silas departed into the pre-dawn darkness did Ruth wake Margaret and explain quickly what was about to happen. Margaret's first response was fear. She protested that Silas would find her, that he would hurt the children for helping her, that escape was impossible. Ruth gripped her mother's shoulders and spoke with fierce urgency. They had 3 hours, maybe 4. A wagon was coming. Margaret had to choose right now whether she wanted to spend whatever years remained to her in this hollow or take the risk of leaving. Thomas arrived with the wagon at 6:30. They had borrowed it from a sympathetic farmer who asked no questions when Thomas paid him double the rental fee. Margaret moved slowly, still weak from months of poor health, her injuries from March still affecting her balance. Ruth packed a small canvas bag with Margaret's few possessions, letters her children had written, photographs of her own mother, the wedding ring Sarah had worn before she died. Margaret paused at the cabin door, looking back at the space that had been her prison for 3 decades. Ruth touched her arm gently. There was no time for reflection. They had to move. The journey to Springfield took 8 hours, the wagon following back roads to avoid any chance of encountering Silas. Margaret said little during the trip, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes distant. When they finally reached the Presbyterian Mission on Kimbrough Avenue, the director, Helen Whitfield, met them at the door. She took one look at Margaret and immediately called for the mission's physician. Dr. Sarah Lindstrom's examination report, preserved in the mission's archives, catalogs decades of systematic abuse, improperly healed fractures, evidence of repeated head trauma, severe malnutrition, and damage consistent with prolonged exposure to violence. Margaret was 44 years old, but her body showed the deterioration of someone far older. Silas discovered Margaret's absence when he returned to the homestead that afternoon. According to James, who remained at the property, his father stood in the empty cabin for several minutes without speaking. Then he methodically searched the premises, finding the missing bag, noting which children were absent. When James refused to provide information, Silas struck him once across the face and left for Forsyth. He went directly to the county courthouse, presenting his marriage certificate to the clerk and demanding assistance in retrieving his wife. The clerk, a young man named Porter Hastings, later testified that Silas showed no emotion beyond cold determination. He claimed Margaret was mentally unstable and required his care. Missouri law gave husbands broad authority over their wives, and Silas intended to exercise that authority fully. But circumstances had shifted in ways Silas did not yet understand. In 1919, while he had been isolated in his hollow, Missouri had quietly amended its marriage statutes. The new law retroactively invalidated marriages between uncles and nieces, classifying such unions as void from their inception. The amendment had received little publicity, passing during the chaos of post-war legislative sessions, but it existed in the legal code nonetheless. Helen Whitfield at the Presbyterian Mission knew about this amendment. When Silas arrived in Springfield 3 days after Margaret's escape, demanding entry and threatening legal action, Whitfield calmly informed him that his marriage had no legal standing. She had already consulted with an attorney, Marcus Feldman, who specialized in family law. Feldman filed paperwork with the Greene County Court, seeking formal annulment and protection for Margaret. Silas hired his own attorney, arguing that the law could not be applied retroactively, that his marriage had been legal when performed, that 30 years of cohabitation established common law rights, even if the original ceremony was now considered invalid. The case went before Judge Raymond Blackwell in February 1922. The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses testified about Margaret's condition, about the decades of isolation and abuse, about the systematic control Silas had maintained. Dr. Lindstrom presented medical evidence. Reverend Stanton provided his journal entries. Even Isaiah Thornton traveled from Forsyth to describe Margaret's desperate attempt to escape in 1897. Margaret herself testified on the final day. She spoke quietly, frequently pausing to collect herself, but her account was devastating in its detail. She described the forced marriage, the violence, the children born into captivity, the years of being told she had no rights and no options. When Silas's attorney attempted to portray her as a willing participant in the marriage, Margaret looked directly at the judge and said simply, "I was 14 years old. My father sold me to settle a debt. I have not had a willing moment in 30 years." Judge Blackwell's ruling came swiftly. He annulled the marriage, citing both the statutory invalidity and what he termed sustained moral turpitude and prolonged abuse of familial trust. The court ordered Silas to maintain distance from Margaret and prohibited any contact. Silas sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face unreadable. He returned to the hollow and continued working his timber claim. His sons refused to speak with him. Ruth married David Brennan 3 months later, and Silas was not invited. When neighbors occasionally asked about his wife, he said only that she had left him. He died in December 1924 of a heart condition, alone in the cabin. None of his children attended the burial. Margaret lived 33 years after her escape, dying peacefully in 1954 at the age of 77. She never returned to the Ozark Hollow. The Presbyterian Mission helped her secure work as a seamstress, and she eventually moved into a small apartment near Ruth's family. Her grandchildren remembered her as quiet, gentle, and prone to long silences, during which she seemed to be somewhere far away. She spoke rarely about those 30 years with Silas. When grandchildren asked about their family history, Margaret would say only that she had been lost for a long time, but was found again. She refused to elaborate. Ruth later explained that her mother had built walls around those memories, protective barriers that allowed her to function in the present by keeping the past contained and distant. The physical damage never fully healed. Margaret walked with a permanent limp. Her hearing in her left ear never recovered, and tremors in her hands persisted until her death. Dr. Lindstrom, who continued treating Margaret throughout the 1920s, noted in her private records that the psychological trauma ran deeper than any physical injury. Margaret startled at loud noises, grew anxious when men raised their voices, and could not bear to be in enclosed spaces for long periods. But she also experienced moments of profound joy that her children witnessed with quiet gratitude. She attended Ruth's wedding and wept openly, something Ruth had rarely seen her mother do. She held her grandchildren and sang them lullabies her own mother had taught her decades earlier. She learned to read properly, taking adult education classes at the public library, finishing books she had only glimpsed in secret during those years in the Hollow. The story might have remained a private family tragedy, known only to Margaret's descendants, except for the work of a historian named Patricia Drummond. In 1986, Drummond was researching Ozark genealogy for a book about isolated mountain communities. She discovered the marriage record between Margaret and Silas while examining courthouse archives in Taney County, noting the unusual familial relationship and the bride's young age. Further investigation led Drummond to the 1922 annulment proceedings, which had been filed separately in Greene County. The trial transcripts had been preserved, and they revealed a story far more disturbing than Drummond had anticipated. She spent 2 years tracking down Margaret's surviving descendants, interviewing grandchildren and great-grandchildren who shared family letters, photographs, and oral histories. Drummond's book, published in 1989, brought Margaret's story to public attention for the first time. The local newspaper in Springfield ran a feature article. Historians recognized the case as documentation of how geographic isolation, legal loopholes, and patriarchal social structures had enabled systematic abuse to continue for decades without intervention. Margaret's youngest daughter, Clara, was 84 when Drummond's book appeared. She gave a single interview to the Springfield newspaper, choosing her words carefully. She said her mother had possessed extraordinary strength, that surviving what she survived, and still finding the capacity to love her children and grandchildren, demonstrated a resilience most people could never comprehend. Clara also said something else, something that appeared in the final paragraph of the article. My mother told me once, near the end of her life, that she didn't want people to remember her as a victim. She wanted to be remembered as someone who endured, who escaped, and who taught her children that no circumstances are permanent. She said the worst prison is believing. You have no choice. The marriage certificate still exists in the Taney County archives, a preserved piece of documented horror. Beside it now sits a notation referencing the annulment and a brief summary of Margaret's story. It serves as a reminder that justice, however delayed, can still arrive, and that even the most isolated voices can eventually be heard. If this story affected you the way it affected me while researching it, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just old stories buried in archives. They're reminders of the battles people fought so we could have the protections we sometimes take for granted today. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Margaret's story. Sometimes knowing that others survived the impossible gives us the strength to face our own struggles. I'll see you in the next one.